Are you a spiritual overachiever? As in, memorize 42 Bible verses by the age of 10 just so God wouldn't be mad at you? Same. They told me if I was good, God would stay. Then this disruptive Swiss theologian came and said, "Girl, you never left. Let's unlearn fear-based faith together." We need to talk. But before we do, I'm Jackie, and this is your season pass to Spiral On. Karl Barth. I don't know about y'all, but I grew up in a very Christian household. My grandfather was ordained, my dad ordained, my uncles ordained. Everywhere I looked, let's just say potlucks and pastoral credentials ran deep. And while I grew up surrounded by a lot of love, I also grew up with a whole lot of confusion about practical theology. I accepted Christ at the ripe age of 6 because I was afraid I would go to hell if I died in a car crash on my way home from church. Yeah, that's a different spiral for another day. But for now, let me ask you this. Are there things you believe about God that you've inherited that might actually not be biblical? That question was at the forefront for me when I got older. And somewhere in the wrestling, God invited me on an adventure. Through pain, through prayer, through divinity school. And along the way, I met a rad dude with a similar story. A guy with his own theological legacy, raised in a deeply religious, highly academic Swiss Reformed family. But instead of following the expected path, he wrestled with culture, church norms, and the proper way of doing theology, bringing about one of the most influential works in modern Christian history. Meet my friend, Karl Barth.
It could happen at any time. A car crash, a roller coaster malfunction, a rogue dodgeball in youth group. One second you're here, the next you might be extra crispy. Fire insurance, the only eternal coverage plan accepted at heaven's gates. Don't risk the burn.
So who exactly is this guy, and why should we care about him today? Well, Karl was just a Swiss dude from a family of ministers. But Karl wasn't just some legacy kid towing the line. From 1911 to 1921, Karl served as a local pastor in the tiny working-class town of Saffenwell, Switzerland. In 1914, 93 German scholars, including Karl's own mentors, signed a public manifesto supporting Kaiser Wilhelm's war policy. It shook his trust in the theological systems he'd been handed. Meanwhile, in his own church, parishioners were fighting for a just wage, and Karl found himself not just at the pulpit, but in the struggle standing with them. But here's the twist. Even though Karl backed his beliefs with action, he didn't turn the gospel into mere social concern. He saw the danger in what theology was becoming. Even at his young age, historian Terry Billards writes, Karl was voicing a concern that contemporary Christian thought was in danger of becoming more anthropology than theology. In other words, he saw how theology had become a mirror of human culture instead of a critique of it. So as all of this brewed in him, World War I, cultural collapse, personal disillusionment, Karl sat down to write a commentary on Romans to clarify his own thinking, except he accidentally rang the theological alarm bells. He later described it like this: "I was like a man in a dark church tower who tripped and grabbed the bell rope to steady himself and accidentally alarmed the whole town." That commentary sparked a revolution of sorts in 20th century theology. Barth's object, Billards writes, was to let the apostolic message of Paul's letter to the Romans break with full force on the present age. That message was not, "You're doing great." It was, "Christ alone." Karl would go on to write more than 500 books, sermons, and essays, culminating in his magnum opus, Church Dogmatics. We're zooming in on one section, Volume 4. So let's dive in. Before we jump into Church Dogmatics Volume 4, let's pause for a second and consider how many of us have internalized the gospel. And let me know if this sounds familiar to you. Just like Karl grew up with a tradition he eventually had to wrestle with, a tradition he didn't throw out, but also didn't blindly obey. A lot of us were handed a version of the gospel that might have been well-intentioned, but also might have missed the point. As a pastor's kid, it was basically a requirement for me to know the sinner's prayer in the womb. I could walk a second grader through it over a juice box. But here's the thing, the version of the gospel I inherited: be good or burn. Fire insurance. You say the prayer to avoid something, not to embrace someone, mostly because you don't want to go to hell. But here's the tragedy, you can't scare someone into love. But the gospel was so much more than a way out of damnation. It's a way into communion, into Christ himself. That's where Karl Barth changed everything for me. In Church Dogmatics, he writes about Jesus, not as a get-out-of-hell-free card, but as the actual gift. Salvation is more than being. Salvation is fulfillment. The the supreme, sufficient, definitive, and indestructible fulfillment of being. That's so different than how I was taught to think about salvation. Not as a transaction, as the deep, abiding presence of a God who wants to be with us. Now let's take a look at how Karl unpacks that, because what he says next might just reintroduce you to Jesus. Here are some huge takeaways from Church Dogmatics Volume 4, Section 57. Number 1, Jesus the person, not the system. Jesus is a person. I know, that sounds obvious, but it wasn't always that way for me. Growing up, I heard about Jesus constantly. Sunday school, midweek service, Christian radio. He was everywhere. But looking back, I hadn't really met Jesus. Christianity was more of a reputation. I wasn't just following Jesus. I was representing my parents, my family legacy. And the gospel? It was a system. And boy, did I know how to work it. Do this, don't do that. Be better, be quieter, be good. But to this, Karl interjects. He is not merely the redeemer of our being, but as such, the giver, and himself the gift of its fulfillment, and therefore the goal and end of the way of God. Jesus isn't just the path to the goal. He is the goal. Not just a way to avoid hell and get into heaven, but he is the gift himself. Salvation isn't about getting good. It's about getting God. And not him eventually, but him now. Number 2, God with us, even when it doesn't feel like it. Be so for real with me right now. Hardship is often treated as a failure of faith, as if pain proves distance. But in my experience, it's in the darkest moments that God with us becomes undeniable, invited to become well acquainted with who Paul calls the God of all comfort. And Karl puts it like this: God with us is true when the people is at rest. It is also true when the enemy invades and devastates the land. It is always true, in spite of and in the most irresistible movements of history. So God with us isn't a mood, and it's not dependent on circumstances or mindset. It's reality, a reality that doesn't disappear when life stops being aesthetic or controllable. Number 3, the wild reversal, us with God. As if God with us wasn't already extraordinary, we get the wildest Uno reverse, us with God. And Karl goes off saying, what unites God and us men is that he does not will to be God without us. What? Not out of loneliness or need, but out of relentless, overflowing love. This should inform how we view salvation. He doesn't just pardon us, he welcomes us. So what does that change? Well, for starters, it changes our whole identity. You're not a cosmic afterthought. You're family. Second, we clearly have a purpose, and not one tied to an outcome of behavior. But your unremarkable Tuesday is now part of God's unfolding story. And finally, we're secure. Karl writes, he creates us rather to share with us, and therefore with our being and life and act, his own incomparable being and life and act, that he does not allow his history to be his and ours, but causes them to take place as a common history. If your life and God's life are intertwined, you can't outrun his presence. And that, friends, is where fear-based faith finally runs out of room. Because truly, there is no fear in love. So here's the thing about Karl Barth. He didn't throw out everything he was raised with in a blaze of youthful rebellion. He investigated. He held his theology up to the light of scripture, even when it meant questioning his mentors and his culture. He was literally banned from Germany during World War II for refusing to go along with a version of Christianity that was twisted to serve empire. When Karl encountered God, there was no room for destructive fear, just conviction and obedience to the supremacy of Christ. So here's the question. What would faith look like if fear was no longer the foundation?